She never expected her first time would happen in the shower, of the man she once feared most, the man whose name made every maid in the estate shiver, the one they whispered about in the laundry room like a ghost story. Mason Grant. Cold, rich, untouchable. Lana pressed the towel tighter around her as the bathroom door clicked shut behind her. The steam curled around her skin and blurred her vision. Her heart thudded like a drum in her ears. She had only come in to retrieve a tray someone had left behind, but now she was locked in the CEO's private marble bathroom, with the sound of water echoing off the tiles, and the soft hum of a man she was never meant to see or hear. She stood frozen, her bare feet on the warm tiles when suddenly the humming stopped. The shower door creaked open and the silhouette appeared, his frame tall, broad, defined by water and wealth. Mason Grant stepped out, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, towel loose around his waist before his eyes found hers, and the air between them changed. It wasn't shock or anger that crossed his face, but something quieter, something unreadable. Lana tried to speak, her voice caught in her throat. "I am sorry. I thought this was empty." He stepped closer, his brows drawn not with rage, but with something that looked too much like curiosity. "You are the new maid?" he asked, his voice low, rough from the steam. She nodded, clutching the towel around her chest tighter. "I'm Lena. I just started last week. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was dared to come in here for a prank. I swear I wasn't trying to." He took another step, and now they were close enough that she could smell the faint trace of cologne mixed with soap and something inherently him, the kind of scent that lingers even when the man is long gone. His gaze lowered, then lifted, meeting hers. "You know this is the kind of moment people write lies about," he said, and she wasn't sure if it was a warning or an invitation. Her breath caught in her throat and something inside her trembled. Not with fear, but with anticipation, with a feeling she didn't understand, not until his hand moved slowly to brush a strand of damp hair behind her ear. She should have run, should have screamed, should have thrown something and left, but she stood still as he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't touch you unless you ask me to." And in that moment the choice was hers, completely, terrifyingly hers. She nodded once, slowly, and that was all it took. His lips met hers like heat meeting skin, urgent, unsure, and yet full of something that felt strangely like truth. Minutes, or maybe hours later, as the world quieted around them, the steam still thick, the moment still trembling, Mason leaned in close again, his voice soft but clear, and this time his words weren't an offer, they were a promise. "You can keep my heart, but whatever you do, do not give it back." She didn't understand what he meant, not yet, not fully, but the way his hand lingered against her cheek, the way he stared into her like he had known her long before this moment, told her it meant more than she was ready to hear, and it scared her more than anything ever had, because in one night everything changed. The man she thought was made of stone had whispered something that cracked open a door inside her, and behind it was something terrifying, something fragile, something dangerously close to love. Lana Grace had grown up in a part of Missouri where dreams were the only luxury people could afford, a place where silence filled the space between broken promises and bills that never stopped coming. Her father passed when she was 15, a quiet man with calloused hands who worked until his last breath, and her mother spent the next years floating between hospital beds and whispered prayers that never seemed loud enough to be answered. Lana had always known she needed to escape, but never imagined the path would lead her here, to a mansion perched above the cliffs of Monterey, California, working as a maid for one of the most powerful and least understood men in the state. Mason Grant was a name that commanded attention, whispered with envy and awe in business circles and luxury lounges. His company Grant Dynamics had revolutionized real estate technology, turning cities into living systems and data into billions. He had built it from the ruins of his father's failed empire, with a reputation for being ruthless, genius, and unreachable. He was the kind of man who was seen more often on magazine covers than in real life, the kind of man whose staff feared him more than the market itself. The kind of man who lived behind walls of glass and silence, and yet, on the day Lana arrived to begin her contract, he had opened the front door himself. She remembered the moment clearly, her palm sweaty on the handle of her suitcase, the sun blinding her as he stepped into view. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, his jaw shadowed with a hint of evening stubble, his eyes cool and unreadable as he looked her over. "Welcome," he said, and that was it. No smile, no handshake, just that single word like an order wrapped in civility, and for the next 6 days, that was all she heard from him, until the shower incident. The mansion itself was like something out of a dream, or a very specific kind of movie, the kind Lana used to fall asleep watching on her cracked laptop as a teenager. It had 4 floors, an infinity pool that overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and rooms with ceilings so high her voice echoed when she cleaned the chandeliers. Her assigned quarters were modest but elegant, a guest room on the 2nd floor with a balcony that caught the morning sun, and a bathroom bigger than her entire childhood home. She was told not to wander, not to ask questions, and above all, not to enter the East Wing without permission. Most of the other staff had been there for years, loyal, silent, efficient people who looked at Lana like a temporary wrinkle in their routine. But she kept her head down, folded linens and wiped glass without a word, only sometimes letting herself wander in thought, wondering who Mason Grant really was. What kept a man like him locked away in a fortress of stone and steel? He rarely left his office, and when he did, it was either to exercise in the private gym or walk the long stretch of garden behind the estate alone. No visitors, no parties, no trace of the usual billionaire lifestyle she had imagined when taking this job. But then again, nothing about him was what she expected. She had expected arrogance, but found something closer to grief. Expected heat, but met a kind of cold so refined it almost became elegance. And the more she observed, the more she realized the man was not hiding from the world, but from himself. On the 6th day, everything shifted. It started with laughter from the kitchen. Someone dared Lana to do something stupid, lighthearted, something to break the monotony. She resisted at first, but after a few shots of cheap tequila snuck in behind the head chef's back, and a string of jokes that turned into dares, she found herself holding a silver tray and stepping toward the forbidden hallway. "You'll be in and out," someone whispered. "Just grab the glass from the bathroom counter and come right back." She didn't expect the door to be unlocked, or the room to be filled with steam, or the sound of water and soft humming to rise like a spell around her. And she certainly didn't expect her body to freeze, or her voice to vanish when he turned and looked at her the way no one ever had. Now everything was different. The mansion didn't feel like a job site anymore. It felt like a game board, and she wasn't sure if she was a player or a pawn. And Mason, well, he was no longer just the man behind the locked doors. He was something else, something unfinished, something beginning. The next morning, the air in the mansion felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Lana moved through the halls in silence, her hands working by muscle memory while her mind replayed every second of the night before, the warmth of the water, the softness of his voice, the way his fingers had brushed her skin, like he was asking for permission without ever speaking, the way her breath caught when he leaned in and how it never quite returned to normal again. The shame didn't hit her like a wave. It came slow and hollow, like a shadow creeping along the edges of her chest, reminding her she had broken rules, not just of work, but of her own body, her own story. She had never been touched like that. Never kissed, not really. Not in a way that made her feel seen, not in a way that made her feel chosen. Her virginity was something she'd held on to, not out of religious conviction or some moral code, but because no one had ever made her feel safe enough to let it go until Mason, and yet that thought scared her more than the moment itself, because Mason Grant was not safe, not in the traditional sense. He was power incarnate, a man who could crush reputations with a word, who could replace her in an hour and forget her in a week. So why did it feel like something else had passed between them? Something that reached beyond the skin. That day she avoided him. She cleaned the West Wing twice, mopped floors that were already shining, polished silver that didn't need touching, anything to stay far from the East Wing. But fate was not a respecter of fear, and by evening, as the sky turned orange and pink with the coming dusk, she heard the sound of his voice from the garden. "Lana, come with me." The words weren't a question, and yet they weren't quite a command either. She followed without speaking, her fingers curled around the hem of her shirt, trying not to shake. The garden behind the mansion was wild but elegant, a stretch of land framed by ivy-covered walls and old fountains and stone paths that wound between rose bushes and tall cypress trees. The ocean below roared against the cliffs far beneath them as Mason walked ahead, hands in his pockets, silent until they reached a bench near the edge. He stopped, turned, and looked at her. "You regret it?" He said it plainly, no flourish, no pretense, just the truth, and she found herself shaking her head even as her voice struggled to catch up. "I don't," she whispered. "I'm just scared." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he let on. "Not of me?" he asked. And she hesitated, then said, "Maybe not the way you think, then, how?" He sat down on the bench, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, like a man always calculating. She joined him, unsure where to place her hands, unsure how close was too close. "I've never done anything like that before," she admitted, "and I don't usually, I didn't come here for that." He smiled, but it was a tired thing, not mocking, not amused, just worn, like a man who'd seen too many people say too many of the same things. "Neither did I," he replied. "I've lived in this place for years, surrounded by people who pretend to care, who smile because they want something, but last night you didn't want anything from me, and that was rare." His words made her stomach twist, and not in a bad way, but like something was waking up, something she hadn't realized had been sleeping. "You don't even know me," she said barely above a breath, and yet he looked at her like he did. That night changed something between them. A thread had been pulled, and now the fabric of their roles no longer fit as neatly. Lana still cleaned the rooms, folded the towels, arranged the flowers, but now, when she passed him in the halls, their eyes met and held longer than before. Sometimes he would ask her to stay a moment longer, just to talk. Sometimes he would stand beside her in the kitchen after hours, his sleeves rolled up, his fingers tracing the rim of a wineglass, while they talked about books or movies, or nothing at all. One night a week later, he found her in the library, curled on the leather sofa with a worn copy of a romance novel she hadn't even noticed when he sat down beside her, until she smelled the faint trace of his cologne. "I didn't take you for someone who read fairy tales," he said, and she smiled without looking up. "Maybe I just like stories where people get to choose each other, even when they come from different worlds." He didn't say anything, but when she finally looked up, he was already watching her with an expression that made her feel like she was on fire. Still, they never spoke of the shower again, as if saying it aloud would break the spell. Instead, they let the silence between them do the speaking, and that silence grew heavier each day, thicker, until it felt like something had to give. That moment came during the gala. Every year, the Grant Foundation hosted a charity event in the city's most luxurious hotel, a place of chandeliers and marble and velvet rope. Lana was not supposed to attend. She was staff invisible, background. But this year, everything was different. Mason called her into his office 2 days before and told her he needed her help. "I want you there with me as a guest," she blinked, unsure if she heard him correctly. "Why me?" "Because I trust you," he said, and that word hit her harder than anything else ever had. He sent a dress, a long emerald green gown that shimmered when she moved, with shoes and earrings, and a small handwritten note. "You belong in more than uniforms," when she entered the ballroom, on his arm. Every head turned, whispers flitted through the air like dust, but Mason kept her close, his hand resting lightly on her lower back, introducing her not as a maid, not as a date, but simply as someone important. Her name on his lips sounded like something holy. Later that night, after too much wine and too many forced smiles, she found herself on the hotel balcony, the city glittering below her like spilled diamonds, the air cool against her skin, and suddenly Mason was beside her again. "You were amazing tonight," he said, and she laughed, barely holding back the truth. "I don't belong here." He looked at her and said something that made her entire body still. "You belong wherever I am." And then he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered the words that would change everything. "I need you to pretend to be my wife for the next 3 months." Mason's words hung in the air like a challenge too big to ignore. Lana stared at him. The city lights shook from the gentle breeze. Her mind a whirl of questions. Why me to be his wife? What did he hope to gain? But before she could speak, his gaze shifted to the skyline, the world outside their secluded balcony, a stark contrast to the secret world they were building together. Lana's breath caught in her throat, because she realized in that moment she didn't need to belong to the world. She needed to belong to him. Suddenly, everything else seemed small compared to what lay between them. He reached out one finger, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and said it again. I need you as my wife for 3 months to secure a merger and to protect the foundation, and I want you by my side. And even though her mind screamed this was terrifyingly public, her heart whispered, yes, please. They spent the next few days preparing for the contract, living side by side in the guest quarters, shadowed by the mansion, but closer than they had ever been. She found herself slipping into routines with him, waking together, sharing coffee in the breakfast room. Her emerald dress pressed on the bed before them became something more than a costume. It became a shield, a promise. He watched her often in the mornings, sunlight brown eyes soft and attentive, as though he was memorizing her for times when he would have to go back to being Mason Grant, the CEO of an empire. Lana began to notice small differences in him. The way he laughed more easily when she was around, the way he slowed to show her private corners of the estate, places no one else was allowed. He didn't hide from her, he invited her in. But even as they grew closer, a twist of doubt began to coil in the back of her mind, because she had found that folder of documents in his study, the one that revealed the story of her father, of the trust fund he had set up to rescue his company after the crash, the same crash that had taken everything from her family and caused her father's final breakdown. The same company that Mason had stepped into and rebuilt from nothing to billions. She confronted him in the dead still of his office, late an evening when the city outside was quiet enough to hear regret. She laid the folder on his desk and spoke it all. Want to tell me whose fault it really was that my father died? She asked him straight on. And Mason's expression shifted, suddenly, vulnerable, like a man who had been carrying a secret too heavy for one lifetime. He took a long, slow breath and said, Your father saved my company when I needed it most. He staked everything to keep it alive because he believed not in me but in what I could do for the people I had never met. And in doing so, he lost everything but integrity. And then, he paused as if waiting for something before he added, I have carried his debt every day since, not out of obligation but out of gratitude. Because I never knew how to repay him until I met you. Lana's heart twisted and shook her legs, nearly gave out as he said, I thought hating me would be easier than loving me, but now I know they are the same thing, always wrapped around each other like this. The next morning, Lana decided to leave the mansion by moonlight. She packed her clothes into her worn suitcase, her hand shaking not from fear but from sorrow, because she had fallen into something terrifyingly beautiful, and yet there was no place in Mason's life for her, not really. Not once the contract was over. She tucked a small note into his study addressed to Mason. I cannot be your wife, but I can be your heart. She left it on his desk, among the silent papers, and slipped out the door before dawn. But the last thing she heard before the gate closed behind her was his voice, low and raw. Lana, don't run from us. And that plea echoed like a prayer in her mind as she disappeared into the night. Weeks passed with no word until one evening she received an email, not from his assistant, not from the company address, but from Mason himself. It simply said, meet me at the library Thursday night, and nothing else. Her heart throbbed as if he'd sent the message with his own pulse. She had no apartment in the city anymore, or a storage building full of her belongings, just a single copy of that emerald dress she had never worn again, and enough courage to walk back through those front doors, because despite everything she knew, she needed to hear it from him again. When she arrived, the library was empty and silent, except for the smell of old leather and the faint drone of the ocean in the distance. Mason stood under one of the tall windows, his silhouette caught between the lamplight and the stars. He turned when she stepped in. He walked across the room, his hands open, stopped 2 feet away from her. He didn't look angry or triumphant. He looked relieved. I was wrong, he said, without sounding like he'd rehearsed it. I built an empire, but I forgot how to be human without you. And he reached forward, placing one hand on her cheek, his thumb stroking down her cheekbone, as though he was memorizing the shape of her face. Your father saved me. Your love saved me. Now I want to repay them both. Lana's voice faltered, like a glass cracking. I don't know if I can trust a promise made so late. He let out a breath softer than relief. I don't expect anything from you but the truth. And he stepped back between them. Hold out your hand, She was afraid only because she didn't trust that fairy tales had places in mansions. He knelt on one knee on the library floor, the carpet thick beneath his suit trousers. He slipped a modest ring onto her finger, simple, elegant. It was a place-holding ring, a promise. Mason looked up at her with those brown eyes that had softened into something better than power alone. I don't want a contract anymore. I want you as my wife, for as long as you will let me. Tears blurred Lana's vision. She swallowed hard and lifted her hand to touch the ring. I will, she whispered, and when he pulled the chair toward her, she sat beside him and wrapped her arms around him, finally letting the moment be real and uncertain, and ours. They stayed there in silence as the library faded around them, the night deepened outside, and for once in his life, Mason Grant didn't feel half-built or half-broken. He stood complete, and she did too. And they built themselves into a story that began with a contract, but ended with something neither had seen coming. Love, shaped by truth and redemption, layered on grief and loyalty and quiet courage. The night of the charity gala arrived, draped in soft silver rain and the distant hum of city lights. Mason stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom across the room from the dark tailored suit, his shoulders squared but his eyes scanning the entrance, not for donors, not for shareholders, but for her. Lana appeared in the doorway, wearing the same emerald dress she had once worn during their first public outing together, and for a moment time folded, the noise dimmed, and all he saw was her. The woman who had changed everything by simply walking into his life, uninvited, unpolished, and absolutely unforgettable. Lana felt the weight of eyes, the weight of expectations, yet all she saw was him standing at the end of the room with his hands tucked into his pockets. His stance formal, but the softness in his gaze undoing her completely. She moved through the crowd like a current pulled toward a quiet shore. And when she finally reached him, he didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, as though he couldn't quite believe she had come back. Not after all the distance, not after the doubts, not after the silence. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice barely audible over the soft music. But it wasn't the compliment that reached her. It was the sincerity behind it. And she nodded, unsure what else to say. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. A moment that held the weight of everything unspoken between them. Before either could say more, the gala host appeared, inviting them to the stage, where Mason was scheduled to present the final donation to the children's hospital. Lana hesitated for a heartbeat, unsure if she belonged there. But Mason offered his hand, silently asking her to stand beside him, and she did, her fingers sliding into his with quiet certainty. As they stepped onto the stage, the crowd applauded, but Mason's voice, when he finally spoke, didn't carry the polished tone of a CEO. It trembled with something deeper, something real. "Tonight isn't just about money or buildings or legacy," he said, looking not at the audience but at Lana. "It's about second chances, about finding something worth more than profit, more than prestige, and somehow knowing you may lose it if you don't fight for it." His voice cracked, and he let it, no script, no pretense, just truth. "I owe the man who built this company everything, but I owe the woman beside me even more, because she reminded me that power without purpose means nothing, and love without courage is just another secret buried under fear." The room fell into silence, and Lana's breath caught in her chest, because she knew this wasn't about business. This was him choosing to say it in front of the world without asking for anything in return. And just like that, she felt something shift, something open. She reached for the microphone, her fingers brushing his, and said softly, "I was never meant to be here. I was a maid in a mansion where I didn't belong, in a life too big for me. But somehow, I found someone who didn't care where I came from, only where I was willing to go with him. And if love is a gamble, then tonight, I choose to bet everything on it, because it's the only thing that's ever felt like home." The applause came like a wave, but it didn't matter to them, not anymore. Their hands still held the electricity of truth, still bound by the quiet promise between their eyes. After the ceremony ended, they slipped outside into the soft rain. Mason removed his jacket and placed it over Lana's shoulders, and for the first time since that day in the shower when everything had begun, she leaned her head on his shoulder with no fear, no hesitation, just belonging. But the peace didn't last long. By the time they returned to the mansion, Mason's lawyer was already waiting, a man with sharp lines and sharper news. "There's been a move against the foundation," he said. "Someone filed a motion to freeze the assets citing fraud on the original charter. Your name is being linked to manipulation." Mason tensed, but Lana stepped forward calmly. "Who filed the motion?" she asked, and the lawyer hesitated before answering. "Your uncle, the board member who never wanted Mason to keep the company in its current form. He's betting the scandal will force a buyout before Mason turns 35 and the inheritance becomes permanent." Mason looked at her, then not as a man with solutions, but as a man tired of surviving without her. "We have 2 weeks before the board meets again," the lawyer added, "and if we don't prove the authenticity of the foundation, or your relationship, everything could collapse, not just the hospital but the company too." The stakes had changed. This was no longer about their love story. It was about preserving a legacy built on risk and hope, and the fragile belief that one choice could still change everything. That night, Lena sat alone in the guest room, staring at her reflection, the ring on her finger glinting under the lamplight. It had started as a symbol of a contract, but now it meant something more. She thought of her father, of how he had gambled everything on an idea that never quite bloomed, and how Mason had taken the ashes and tried to grow something new, not out of guilt, but out of honor. And for the first time, she didn't see herself as just the maid or just the girl who had fallen too fast, too deeply. She saw herself as someone with the power to hold something sacred together. Downstairs, Mason stood in front of the fireplace, his thoughts heavy when Lana stepped in, her expression steady. "I'll go to the board," she said. "I'll tell them everything. That this began as a business arrangement, but became something that neither of us expected, and if they ask, if I love you, I'll say yes, because I do, and even if they take the money, even if they shut it all down, it will never change what we built in each other." Mason turned to her, and in that moment all the walls he had ever built crumbled, because she had chosen him, again, not for wealth or protection, but for the truth they had created together. Over the next few days they worked together day and night, gathering documents, photos, testimonies, anything that proved not just the legitimacy of the foundation, but the authenticity of their relationship. They called in nurses who had been helped, patients who had received care, stories of small miracles born from quiet compassion. Lana shared her journal entries, the ones she had written after their first kiss, after their first fight, after the first time she truly saw him, not as a CEO, but as a man afraid to be loved for who he was rather than what he owned. The morning of the board meeting arrived and the sky was clear. As if holding its breath, the conference room was full of shareholders, advisors, and silent watchers. But it was Lana who stood at the head of the table and began. She spoke, not with bravado, but with vulnerability. She told them about the contract, about how she had agreed to pretend for a cause that deserved to be real. But then she looked at Mason and said, "The pretending ended a long time ago, and what we have now is the most real thing I've ever known." When she finished, there was a moment of stillness. Then one of the senior board members stood and said, "We don't care about the contract, we care about the results. The hospital is built. The patients are real. The mission lives. And if love came with it, then maybe we finally got something right." A vote was cast. The motion to dissolve the foundation failed. The inheritance confirmed, the company preserved, and the future of the hospital secured. Back at the mansion that night, Mason and Lana sat on the balcony, wrapped in a single blanket, the city below them wide and quiet, their fingers laced together. And Mason turned to her and said, "I once told you not to give my heart back. Now I'm asking you to keep it forever." And Lana smiled, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with the certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it, side by side. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the guest quarters, where Lana woke, tangled in the crisp white sheets. Memories of the gala and the board meeting drifted through her mind like soft music. She smiled without fully waking, then realized Mason was gone, causing a dull ache in her chest. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and noticed a note on the nightstand. It was from him, 4 simple words, "Call me when you wake." They weren't grand gestures, just a quiet reminder she wasn't alone. Downstairs, she found him in the library, sitting at the grand desk, scattered papers, evidence of their efforts strewn around him, his posture stiff as though waiting for her. She crossed the room and slid into the chair across from him. He looked up, and there it was, the vulnerability she loved, and feared all over his face. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, almost failing to speak. "My heart is full," she said, "but my mind is tired. Because what we built doesn't belong to just us anymore. It belongs to everyone who believed in us. And isn't that beautiful? Yes, she whispered, because real love is never private. It's public, messy, and raw. And when it's tested, it either breaks or it shatters glass ceilings. They worked through the day, drafting speeches and letters and reviewing terms for the hospital launch. Everything they had built teetered on those final details. But then Mason paused, closing his eyes as though trying to steady his breath. Lana reached out, brushing her fingers across his knuckles. When he opened his eyes, she saw the weight he carried. He hadn't been to sleep since the night before, because after the vote, his uncle filed another motion contesting the inheritance, claiming that the contract with Lana gave him undue influence. She turned paler than she'd expected, because their story hadn't just saved the foundation. It had threatened dynasties. Now, the entire future of the company, their future wavered on a legal line. That evening, they walked the perimeter of the estate, the ocean cliffs dark and endless beside them. The air smelled of salt and possibility. She asked him why he still fought, why he didn't walk away, and he pulled her close under the moonlight, because letting go would mean admitting they were wrong. Allowing themselves to love across class and privilege was the only thing that ever felt courageous enough. And that night, as the wind tangled their hair and the world felt strangely silent, he promised her nothing would take her away from him, least of all fear. The next morning, chaos arrived. Legal teams issuing notices, the media picking up whispers of controversy, and the palace of glass and steel began to feel less safe and more like a target. Lana felt it too. She used the momentum of their love as fuel to fight fiercely until fatigue caught up with her. Late that evening, she collapsed onto the living room sofa. Mason wrapped around her blanket, and concern warmed his voice. "Are you okay?" She leaned her head into his chest, and the rhythms of his heartbeat steadied her. The vulnerability between them deeper than any glossy rooftop kiss, stronger than any wealth or scandal. Because raw truth doesn't die, it blossoms where it's nurtured. But just when the world seemed to be shifting, the twist came from inside their circle. A familiar face leaned in under the guise of support, offering legal help and a seat on the board. It was a woman from Mason's past, someone he had introduced Lana to months earlier. Smiles, charm, and handshake, but behind the grace she carried ambition and resentment, rooted in betrayal. Her arrival coincided with whispers in boardrooms and calls from investors voicing concern. Giving Mason her approval would be easier if he just distanced himself from public scrutiny, and distance meant Lana and Mason felt the coldness swallow rooms they once shared together, shared secrets. She watched him remove his hand from hers across a rooftop balcony, and he still didn't explain. But his silence said more than words could hold. They spoke that night. Were the words sharp but honest? Lana demanded clarity. "Our story can't survive in whispers and half-truths," and he looked at her as though he would crumble if he spoke. But finally he said, "She's my sister." A sister he hadn't acknowledged publicly for fear of scandal. Decades earlier, she had betrayed the family by running off to marry a man beneath their station. He'd cut ties to protect the company and the inheritance, but she had raised her daughter, who was now next in line to contest their foundation, because our past never stays buried, and it was louder than the truth they had made theirs. Lana stepped back. Her world fractured. She felt small in the vastness of his legacy. She felt betrayed by secrets left untold, and the foundation she had fought for started to blur into a battlefield of inheritance and half-love. She left the balcony and ran down the halls of the mansion, her heart pounding like a warning. She didn't want to fight anymore. She wanted the man she had fallen for, not the empire he inherited. Upstairs, she locked herself in the guest room, holding nothing more than her wedding dress and the ring he gave her, her tears wetting the fabric, as images of what could become a scandalous war danced at the edge of her vision. And for the first time since meeting Mason, she doubted them. She doubted love built on deception, because nothing scarier than the truth is the secrets that protect it. But Mason came back. He came with no announcement, no entourage, just him at the door. Hours later, his eyes red from regret. He didn't knock, he simply let himself in, and saw the dress, the ring, the tears, and the story in her posture. He closed the distance between them, and he didn't ask permission. He sat on the edge of the bed next to her and gently took her hand, breaking silence with a simple plea. "Forgive me," he said without expectation, but with the weight of a man who would rather lose an empire than the woman who taught him how to feel, he explained. Everything from the beginning, from his father's empire falling to the choice to protect the company by burying the scandal from his sister who was a child, but everything had returned to haunt them both. Now, help me fix this. Love across lines of blood and inheritance made them richer as people, but it also made them weaker as an idea, public. But he needed her because she had turned his world from profit to purpose, from inheritance to integrity, and without her he was half built again. She stood and pulled him into her arms, and for a long moment they swayed, not needing music, not needing pretense, just each other. And after a lifetime of loud conferences and public appearances, he whispered into her hair, "Let them come, because we're already together, and the echoes of their love will drown out every lie." And that night they lay together in the guest room, holding hands like children who finally wanted to grow up together. The morning sun slipped quietly into the mansion, transforming every surface into soft gold. Lana and Mason stood on the balcony, wrapped in the silence only love created between two people who had fought and chosen each other again, over everything. He held her hand and said, "This was more than a wedding day. It was a declaration that love could change destinies," and she smiled because she knew how true those words were. They walked inside to find the entire staff gathered in the hall, their faces full of respect and warmth. It was no longer about class differences or roles. It was about family unity, built by courage and honesty. As Lana placed her hand on Mason's chest, she felt the steady beat of his heart and knew she belonged there, not because of money or title, but because she was seen. Later in the courtyard under the sprawling oak tree, friends and family gathered. There was no orchestra, only a few quiet guitars and the chatter of people who had watched a story unfold, one of unity and healing. Mason kneeled and gave Lana a simple ring made from his mother's antique wood. Her eyes glistened, as did his, and no words were needed to say they would face everything together. And in that moment, they did not look at the mansion or the empire. They looked at each other and saw everything they had gained by choosing truth. Months later, they stood outside the newly opened community clinic named for Lana's late father. People streamed in for checkups and therapy. Funding secure, love secure. Mason stood behind the counter, handing out coffee, and Lana greeted patients with gentle words and compassionate smiles. They moved in seamless harmony. Laughter mingling with small success stories ahead lay a foundation built on love, empathy, hard work, and vision. That evening they returned to their favorite bench in the garden, the moon above a gentle witness to everything that had happened, and Lily, their 3-year-old daughter, sat between them, playing quietly with her small wooden car, a gift from Mason's sister, the one who had once threatened their future, now part of their present. Lily looked up at them and said, "Daddy, Mom, you're my favorite forever," she said, and they both laughed and hugged, because forever had begun right there. Mason brushed a strand of hair from Lana's face and kissed her softly and said, "This never would have happened without you," and she shook her head softly, saying, "No, it happened because you risked your empire and your heart for honesty, not deals, not contracts, but for us." And as they looked out at the estate, at the lights of the city beyond, at the life they had built together, they held hands and spoke no words. Because the message was written in every breath, every glance. Love can begin in unexpected places. It can cross borders, class, and legacy, and when it is nurtured by truth and courage, it becomes the most powerful force of all. They had started with a contract, until one moment defined everything, and love responded with forgiveness, growth, promise, and healing. Their story was not about broken rules, but about building bridges between broken hearts. There was not a fairy tale of wealth and magic, but of ordinary people who chose each other against all odds and rebuilt their lives to serve others too. And as the night deepened, the stars looked down like witnesses. They had loved through trust and transparency, and in that quiet, promised that shadows and trophies and titles were nothing compared to a life built on kindness, honesty, compassion, and a love that never asked permission to bloom. They found that true love blossoms when honesty and courage tear down walls, and that real power lies in healing, not control, and that every difference becomes a step toward unity when two people choose each other fully and without regret.